My name is Margot Ellison. I'm 34, and 3 months ago, my mother looked me straight in the eye across a mahogany dining table and said, "Vanessa is the rightful heir. You were always just visiting this family." She said it with the kind of grace only Helena Ellison could muster. Silk voice, perfect posture, not a single porcelain teacup out of place. It was the reading of my grandmother's will. The house, the one I grew up in, with ivy curling up its brick spine and generations of Ellison memories in every floorboard, was left entirely to my sister. So was the heirloom jewelry, the Ellison nameplate, the library, the oil portraits, even the rosewood writing desk I used to sit at with Grandmother Dorothy when I was 10. To me, nothing. No mention, no footnote, not even a pressed flower from the garden I once helped her tend. The silence wasn't just an oversight, it was deliberate. I didn't cry, not in front of them. I signed the release papers, packed the last of my boxes, and left the estate before dusk. No one came outside to say goodbye. I told myself I was done, that the story had ended. But then, last week, while unpacking a crate labeled Mist Mott Attic, I found it. A thin, leather-bound book, tucked beneath old cookbooks and a yellowing Ellison family tree. My grandmother's handwriting, familiar, looping, full of quiet strength, covered the first page. To the one they tried to forget. "You saw more than they realized. You deserve the truth." I sat down on the floor right there in my apartment hallway, the air thick with dust and disbelief, and began to read. With every page, the silence they gave me began to break. They gave Vanessa the house, the heirlooms, and the story, but Grandmother left me the voice. And now, I intend to use it. I wasn't always aware of how different I was, not in the way that makes you feel special, but in the way that makes you invisible in a house that demands perfection. The Ellison estate wasn't just a home, it was a brand, a curated narrative of grace, heritage, and unspoken rules. My sister Vanessa fit into it like a puzzle piece that was carved by generations before us. I didn't. She was the golden child from the moment she took her first breath in the hospital, with monogrammed baby blankets and a birth announcement in the New Hampshire registry. Her curls were framed in silver on the mantle before she could crawl. Her first recital was attended by 3 rows of family in coordinated pastels. Meanwhile, I was the child who colored outside the lines and didn't mind the silence. I was bookish, solitary, careful with words but reckless with ideas. I liked exploring the old shed behind the stables, collecting scraps of rusted history. I asked too many questions at dinner, the kind that made my mother's smile tighten like a noose. "Must you always challenge everything?" she once hissed when I asked why the family crest had Latin written on it that no one could translate. Vanessa got the heirlooms, yes, but she also got the rehearsed love, the one passed around like polite conversation. I got something quieter, something from Grandmother Dorothy. She never said much in front of Helena, but when the two of us were alone in the West Wing library, she would wink and hand me dusty books with missing pages. "You're the only one curious enough to notice what's missing," she whispered once. I remember sitting cross-legged beneath stained glass windows, sunlight throwing fractured color across my knees as she told me stories. Real stories. Not the sanitized Ellison legends that my mother fed guests over oysters. She spoke of the women in our line who had been brilliant but overlooked, bold but rewritten. She called them shadows with voices. She told me I had that voice too, and warned me gently that some people would spend their lives trying to silence it. I didn't understand then. Not fully. But I started noticing things. Vanessa was given our grandmother's pearls to wear at family portraits. Though I was the one who stayed up late organizing grandmother's archives, Vanessa was allowed to speak at her Sweet 16 dinner, even though I was the one who actually helped plan it behind the scenes. I wasn't envious, at least not at first. I just didn't understand why my mother looked through me, past me, around me, as though I were an extra piece from someone else's puzzle. The only room where I truly felt like I belonged was the library. It smelled of cedar, old ink, and the faintest hint of lavender from grandmother's perfume. That scent followed me like a memory, especially on the days when I came home from school and found my drawings removed from the fridge, replaced with Vanessa's school awards. I remember once, when I was 11, I tried on grandmother's brooch without asking, just to see how it looked. Helena caught me in the mirror. and didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were colder than any slap. "That's not for you, Margot. That piece belongs to our legacy. Try not to touch what isn't yours." She turned on her heel and left me standing there, the brooch suddenly too heavy on my sweater. I didn't cry, just unpinned it slowly and returned it to its velvet box. I understood in that moment what I hadn't wanted to believe before. My place in this family was conditional, fragile, and constantly being audited for errors. Vanessa was the inheritance. I was the footnote. And yet, grandmother kept making space for me in quiet ways. She labeled a shelf in the library Margot's Curiosities and filled it with books that no one else in the house would touch. Journals of forgotten women, records of failed revolutions, memoirs written in exile. I devoured them like oxygen. That shelf became a sanctuary, a place where I didn't have to earn my belonging. When I was 15, she gave me a key. A small brass one on a thin chain. "Not everything worth keeping is meant to be displayed," she said, pressing it into my palm. I didn't know then what it opened, but I wore it every day, hidden beneath my uniform collar. I wore it even the night she passed away. Vanessa cried beautiful tears at the funeral. Helena made speeches. I stayed silent, the key warm against my chest. I didn't speak, not because I didn't feel, but because grief like mine didn't belong in the narrative they were selling. It didn't photograph well. Years passed and the house grew colder, or maybe I just stopped trying to pretend it felt like home. I left for college out of state, never invited to bring friends home for the holidays, always receiving my invitation last, always printed on thinner paper. But I held on to grandmother's key, I held on to the stories, and now holding her journal, reading her words, I know she was leaving me something more than memory. She was leaving me a map, a quiet rebellion etched in ink. And for the first time in my life, I intend to follow it. The journal wasn't ornate. It was simple, bound in worn brown leather, the spine cracked like it had been read and reread across decades. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and age, and the ink had faded just enough to make me lean in. Grandmother's handwriting was neat but intense, like each word had weight. The first few pages were reflections, quiet thoughts on aging, on memory, on the house she once ruled but never truly owned. But by page 12, the tone shifted. "Helena never forgave me for loving you," she wrote, the sentence standing alone, underlined once. I reread that line 5 times, each time feeling it sink deeper. She hadn't meant Vanessa. She had meant me. In a house full of curated affection and performed propriety, that single sentence was the closest I'd ever come to hearing someone say they loved me without conditions. The entries grew sharper. She wrote about my mother's obsession with control, her disdain for vulnerability, her fear of being eclipsed. She sees herself in Vanessa, safe, predictable, malleable. But Margot carries the fire. My throat tightened. No one had ever said that about me. Fire wasn't something we were allowed to be. We were meant to be composed, compliant, collectible. But grandmother had seen me, truly, and it both healed and reopened something I didn't know still ached. She wrote of things I barely remembered, times when she defended me quietly, subtle interventions I'd never realized were deliberate. The time she insisted I be allowed to attend the winter formal, even after Helena declared it pointless for someone like you. The old desk she restored and gave me for my birthday after my mother had thrown out my drawing. "I couldn't change her, but I could make space for you," she wrote. "A child doesn't need perfect parents, she needs a witness. I was yours." There were mentions of Vanessa too, not cruel, just distant. She will inherit the house, but Margot will inherit the story. Another entry, dated just a year before she died, spoke of regret. "I fear they'll silence her, erase her like they tried to erase me once. The women in this family, they are rewritten or removed." I closed the journal for a moment, letting my fingertips rest on the leather cover. It wasn't just a diary, it was a lifeline, a confession, a warning. And most of all, it was an inheritance, not the kind that could be locked in a safe or appraised by auctioneers, but the kind that reshaped the way a person walks through the world. I thought of the last family portrait taken before grandmother's death. Vanessa in the center, Helena to her right, my father smiling tightly beside them. I had been placed at the end, cropped slightly in the printed version they mailed to relatives. I remember laughing awkwardly when I noticed, pretending I didn't care. But I did, of course I did, because every child wants to believe they belong in the frame. The grandmother must have noticed too. She must have known. The journal ended with a final, brief entry. They gave her silence. I hope this gives her voice. Tell the truth, Margot, even if it cracks the walls. I sat for hours after reading it, the afternoon light shifting across the floor like time itself, urging me forward. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew one thing. This story was no longer theirs to edit. It was mine to tell. And I would not whisper it. I would not keep it behind glass. I would let it breathe. 2 days after I finished the journal, I drove back to the Ellison estate with no warning, no invitation, and no intention of playing by the rules. The gravel crunched beneath my tires the same way it had since childhood, but this time I didn't flinch. I parked near the side entrance, the one staff used during events, and let myself in through the kitchen. It was empty, polished to perfection, the scent of lemons and control lingering in the air. I walked through the hallway quietly, past the parlor, where Vanessa once held her engagement tea, past the portrait of great-grandfather Ellison that Helena insisted be hung higher than all the others. I found her in the solarium, seated with Vanessa, sipping tea from porcelain cups that hadn't been touched since grandmother's memorial. They both looked up, startled but not alarmed, just inconvenienced. Helena didn't rise. "Margot, you should have called." Her tone was even, rehearsed. Vanessa said nothing. "I found grandmother's journal," I said. I didn't sit, didn't blink, just stood there holding it like an artifact from a crime scene. Helena set her cup down carefully. "That old thing? I assumed it was lost." "No," I replied, voice steady. "You hoped it was buried." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. "What do you want, Margot?" "I want you to know I read every word, and I remember more than you think." Helena tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "And what do you think you've discovered?" The grandmother meant to leave more than a name, that the original will named me the heir to her private library, the jewelry, the cottage in Windermere, even the letters in her study. That you changed it after her stroke. Helena exhaled slowly, folding her hands. "You have no proof, and frankly, I'm disappointed. This fixation of yours, it's unbecoming." "It's the truth," I said, "and it matters." Vanessa finally looked up. "Even if it's true, why bring it up now? What's the point?" Her voice wasn't cruel, just tired. Practiced. Like someone who'd learned how to make betrayal sound like etiquette. I turned to her, the ache rising again. "Because you stood by while she erased me. You got the house, the pearls, the narrative. I got boxed up memories and absence." She blinked, caught off guard. "That wasn't my decision." "But you benefited from it," I snapped, then softened. "And?" You said nothing. Helena stood, adjusting her shawl like armor. "This is not the place for drama. Whatever grandmother wrote, it doesn't change the facts. You were always different. Say it," I said. "Say I didn't belong." Her lips tightened. "You weren't suited for this family. You lacked discipline, poise. You always questioned everything. It was exhausting." I let that sit for a moment, let the weight of her words press into the silence she thought would protect her. Then I stepped forward and placed the journal on the table between them. This belonged to her, not to you, not to Vanessa, to her. And now it belongs to me. Vanessa looked at the cover, then at me. "What are you going to do with it?" I met her gaze. "Tell the truth." Helena scoffed quietly. "And what? Publish it? Embarrass the family?" "No," I said. "Set it free." I turned to leave but paused at the door. "You spent years crafting a version of this family that fit inside a photo frame. But people don't live in frames. They live in the margins." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out the way I came, the air cooler somehow, lighter. Behind me, I imagined them sitting in silence, unsure whether to chase me or bury me again. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't asking to be let in. I was walking out on my own terms, journal in hand, truth intact. The next morning, I booked an appointment with Harrison Langford, the law firm that had managed the Ellison estate for over 40 years. Their office sat above a boutique bank on the quiet side of town, the kind of building that smelled of leather, dust, and discretion. I had barely walked in when the receptionist looked up and said, "You're Margot, aren't you?" I nodded. She led me to a small waiting room paneled with dark wood. A few minutes later, Mr. Langford himself appeared, older now, slightly hunched, but his eyes were sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. "Miss Ellison," he said warmly, motioning me in. "To what do I owe the visit?" I sat down and pulled out grandmother's journal, placing it gently on his desk. "I think something was changed without her consent, and I think you may have a copy of what came before." His face didn't shift, but I noticed the way his fingers tapped once against the desk before he reached for a drawer. "There were versions," he said slowly, "but the last one, the only one Helena authorized for release, was dated 3 weeks before your grandmother passed." "And the one before that?" I asked. He hesitated. "Are you sure you want to see it?" "I need to." He studied me a moment longer, then stood, crossed to the filing cabinet behind him, and pulled out a thick beige folder. Inside were several documents, sealed with thin blue ribbons and bearing grandmother's signature in delicate ink. He handed me the second-to-last version, dated 5 months before her stroke. I unfolded the pages carefully, heart pounding. My name was there, clear, undeniable. "To Margot Ellison, I leave the Windmere Cottage, the complete contents of my personal library, the Ellison Pearl set, and all written correspondence located in my private study." The words blurred for a moment. I blinked hard, letting them sink in. "He changed it," I whispered. "Helena changed it after the stroke. We were told Mrs. Ellison verbally updated her intentions," Langford said cautiously. "Helena presented medical clearance." "But she wasn't lucid then," I said, jaw tightening, "and you know it." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The pause said everything. I looked up. "Can I have a copy of this?" "Officially, no," he said, but then lowered his voice. "But I can let you take a photograph. Strictly off record." I didn't thank him. Not yet. I took out my phone, captured every page, every signature, every clause. The difference between what grandmother wanted and what was executed was no longer a suspicion, it was evidence. I left the building with trembling hands, the cold autumn air biting at my skin. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel uncertain. I felt righteous, vindicated, furious. Back at home, I spread the documents across my coffee table. The original will, the revised version, notes from the journal, dates lined up too perfectly. Grandmother had written in her journal about her plans for me in March. The original will was signed in April. She'd had a minor fall in July. The revised will appeared in August, shortly after her first hospitalization. "You took everything from her," I muttered aloud, not to anyone, but to the memory of Helena's perfect composure. But it wasn't just about the house or the jewelry. It was about agency, about voice, about the way powerful people reshape legacies through silence and signatures. I pulled out the photo I had taken of the page that named me. I stared at it for a long moment, then picked up my phone. I wasn't ready to go public yet, not completely, but I knew who I needed to speak to next, and she wouldn't be expecting my call. The Ellison family held a tradition, each November, a formal gathering to honor the matriarch's legacy. After grandmother's passing, Helena had seamlessly taken that role, hosting an annual luncheon with catered soufflés, muted jazz, and rehearsed stories that painted the family history in sepia-toned perfection. This year, it was held in the drawing room of the estate, Vanessa's estate now, where walls bore portraits of Ellison's past, all lined up like sentinels guarding a carefully edited narrative. I RSVP'd without hesitation. Helena likely assumed I wouldn't come, or worse, that I'd show up, smile politely, and blend into the background like a properly trained disappointment. She didn't know I had the original will, or the journal, or the emails. Yes, emails. A week after photographing the original document, I had contacted Aunt Miriam, one of the few extended relatives who'd once shown me a sliver of warmth. I sent her a scan of the will. She didn't reply immediately, but 2 days later I received a zip folder of forwarded correspondence between Helena and Vanessa from months before grandmother's death. One line stood out. We'll need to update the paperwork now that she's too tired to argue, the subject line read. Margot's clause, remove discreetly. I printed that email, I printed the will, I printed a letter from grandmother's journal, and I slid them all into an envelope marked simply, for the record. When I arrived at the luncheon, the atmosphere was as curated as ever. Vanessa greeted guests in pearls. Helena stood near the fireplace, accepting compliments with the grace of a woman born to be obeyed. Cousins, in-laws, former board members of the family trust floated through the room with champagne in memory. No one noticed me at first. I wasn't in their script. But I made myself visible. I waited until the toast. It always came at exactly 2:30, with Helena raising a crystal flute and saying, "To legacy, to loyalty, to family." As she began the familiar speech, I stepped forward. "Before we raise our glasses," I said clearly, voice cutting through the hum of pretense, "I'd like to read something from Dorothy Ellison herself." The room fell silent. Helena froze, mid-sentence. Vanessa's smile faltered. "Margot," Helena said, measured but sharp. It's precisely the time," I replied. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. "This is a letter from grandmother found in her journal. It reads, 'If this reaches you, it means I've been overwritten. Know that I chose you, not just for your mind, but for your integrity. Do not let them erase what is rightfully yours.'" I turned to the guests, and this, I held up a page, is a copy of the original will dated months before her stroke, where she names me as heir to the cottage, the library, and the heirlooms, none of which were mentioned in the final version executed by Helena. A murmur rippled through the room. Helena stepped forward, her voice low and cutting. "You are making a scene. I am telling the truth," I said, "something this family has avoided for years. You have no right to disrupt—" "No?" I interrupted, louder now. "But you had the right to alter her will while she was hospitalized? You had the right to silence me, to call me unsuited, to tell everyone I was unstable when I asked questions?" Vanessa whispered, "Please stop." But I kept going. "I have emails. From you. From Aunt Miriam. From the lawyer who looked the other way. I know everything you erase, and today I'm putting it back." Helena's eyes narrowed. "You're doing this for attention?" "No," I said. "I'm doing this for grandmother, because she trusted me to finish the story she wasn't allowed to end." Silence fell again, heavy and unmoving. I looked around the room, saw the discomfort ripple across faces too used to smiling through rot. "You can keep the house," I said, turning to Vanessa. "Keep the portraits, keep the illusion, but the truth is out now, and you don't get to bury it again." I left the envelope on the mantel. No dramatic exit, just a quiet, deliberate walk out the front door. No one followed me, no one stopped me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. I didn't sleep the night after the luncheon. Not out of regret, not from fear, but from a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Release. It was as if I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for years. I sat by my window, the city lights below flickering like distant stars. The envelope I'd left behind now just a memory. They would read it, eventually. Maybe they already had. Maybe Helena was pacing her study, rehearsing denials, or Vanessa was crying in the solarium, not out of guilt, but because the script had unraveled. I didn't care. That was the part that startled me most. I didn't care. For the first time, their reactions weren't the point. The truth wasn't for them. It was for me. A week later, I resigned from my part-time job at the university archives and accepted a position I hadn't dared dream of. Curator at the Whitlock Women's History Center, a quiet space dedicated to preserving the lives of women whose stories had been footnoted, altered, or erased. I moved into a small loft nearby, not grand, not historic, not filled with heirlooms, but mine. On my first day, I unpacked grandmother's journal and placed it on the top shelf of my new office, next to a sign that read, "If they tried to silence you, write louder." The director of the center, a sharp-witted woman named Elise, had read my submission essay and asked, over coffee, "Did you really challenge your entire family's inheritance in the middle of a toast?" I nodded. "That's one way to reclaim a story," she said, smiling. "Welcome to the right place." I spent my mornings cataloging letters from suffragists, diaries from women who raised families in silence, poems never published, lives never honored, and in the quiet of that space, something began to heal. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was slow, gentle. I stopped bracing every time the phone rang. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head. I stopped needing Helena's voice to echo in mine. One afternoon, while archiving a collection from a woman named Eleanor Briggs, who had been disowned for choosing a scholarship over a suitor, I found a passage that read, "They told me legacy was about blood. I believe it's about truth." I copied that line onto the first page of my own journal. My legacy would begin there. Windermere Cottage was never returned to me. The pearls stayed locked in Vanessa's safe. The oil portrait still hung in the drawing room. But the story, that was mine now. I didn't need the house. I had a home. Not built from inheritance, but from intent, from words, from voice. Sometimes at night, I would reread grandmother's journal, not out of grief, but as ritual, as reminder. She had known what she was doing when she gave me that brass key. She had seen the storm coming, and she had prepared me to stand in its center and not be moved. I lit a candle one evening and wrote a letter to her, not to be mailed, but to be placed beside her journal. I told her I was safe, that I was strong, that I was telling the story she couldn't, and that, somehow, it had brought me back to life, no longer a footnote, no longer the quiet one, but the author of a new chapter, one no one else would dare rewrite. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when Vanessa texted me. Just 4 words, "Can we meet, please?" I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure whether to respond. I hadn't heard from her since the luncheon. No follow-up, no confrontation, just silence. Part of me expected this to come eventually, but I didn't know what she could possibly say that would make a difference. Still, I replied. We agreed on a small coffee shop halfway between the estate and my new place, one she used to love back when we were still pretending we were sisters in more than just name. She arrived on time, dressed not in designer layers, but in a simple sweater and jeans. No pearls, no polished front. Her face looked drawn, tired in a way that went beyond sleep. She slid into the seat across from me and didn't speak for a full minute. Then she said quietly, "You were right." I didn't respond. I waited. About the will, about grandmother, about Mom. She paused, then added, "About me." Her hands curled around her coffee cup like it was something to anchor her. "I read everything you left. I didn't know how much she had taken from you. From both of us, really. You let her," I said evenly, not out of anger but out of fact. She nodded. "I did. I let her because it was easier, because I was afraid that if I questioned anything, she'd turn on me too. And I wasn't strong enough to survive that." Her honesty startled me more than her guilt. "So you stayed safe," I said, "while I disappeared." "I know," she said. "I know. And I'm not here to defend that. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." There was a quiet between us then. Not tense, just still. I studied her face. The girl I once shared a bunk bed with. The one who always had the bigger slice of cake. The better seat at the table. The stories told in her favor, and yet, in this moment, she looked nothing like the untouchable version of herself she had spent years performing. She looked human. I believed she meant it, but meaning it didn't make it enough. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I don't trust you either, not yet." "I understand," she whispered. She hesitated. "I'd like to try, not to go back. I know we can't, but maybe, forward." I looked down at my cup, then back at her. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're willing to do the work," I said. "Real work. Not just saying sorry in a cafe, but owning what happened, naming it, not letting her rewrite it again." She nodded slowly. "I am." We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just sat there a little longer, 2 women who had grown up under the same roof but on different planets, trying now to meet on neutral ground. Before we parted, she reached into her bag and handed me something wrapped in linen. "These were grandmother's reading glasses," she said. "I found them in one of the boxes. I think she'd want you to have them." I took them without a word. Later that night, I placed them beside her journal in my apartment, gently, like returning a missing piece to a long-lost story. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. 2 months later, on a crisp Sunday morning, I stood in the reading room of the History Center, with the windows open, the scent of old paper and October leaves drifting in. The light fell just right across my desk, golden and warm, illuminating the shelf where grandmother's journal rested beside the small, wooden box that now held her reading glasses. I ran my fingers along the spine of the journal, thinking not just of her, but of every woman whose words were tucked away in archives, footnotes, and forgotten letters. Women like Eleanor Briggs, like Dorothy Ellison, like me. I thought about everything that had happened, about the luncheon, the confrontation, the email, the house, the years of silence, and strangely, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel vindication. I felt clarity. Because legacy, I'd come to realize, wasn't about who inherited the house or the pearls or the seat at the table. It was about who told the story, who carried it forward without shame, who had the courage to look at the ruins of a curated life and say no. That's not all there was. Helena hadn't called since the day of the luncheon. I hadn't expected her to. But I knew she had read what I left behind, and I knew it had shaken something, not enough to change her, but enough to make her wonder if silence would hold this time. Vanessa and I met twice more. Short walks, quiet coffee, no promises, just presence. I didn't offer her full forgiveness, and she didn't ask for it. What she gave me instead was space. And sometimes, space is the real apology. As for the estate, nothing changed. The titles remained in her name. The portraits stayed where they were, but I no longer saw those things as losses. They were weights I'd never been meant to carry. My home was here now, among the shelves, the dust motes, the voices of women whose truths once trembled on the edge of being lost. One evening, Elise asked me to curate an exhibit. Women Erased. I chose 5 stories, mine among them, written under initials only. At the opening, a student stood by my display and whispered, "I think this one's mine too." That moment mattered more than any heirloom ever could. They say inheritance is what's handed down, but I think it's also what you take back, what you reclaim, what you rescue from the margins. I walked away from the Ellison table and built a new one, not carved from old wood and tradition, but shaped by truth, humility, and voices that were once quiet but now refused to be. I don't know if I'll ever be fully understood by the family that raised me. I don't need to be, because the version of me that once needed their approval is gone, and the woman who remains, she holds the pen now. She decides which stories survive, and she's just getting started.